Thanks for joining us on a road trip through rabbinic narrative. No agenda, just clarity. So there's an interesting Midrash that's brought down on a pasuk in Parshas Ekev, Parak Ches Pasuk Daled, where Moshe says, "Simlascha lo bal somealecha v'raglecha lo batzeka zeh arba'im shana." Your clothing didn't wear out, and your feet didn't swell these 40 years. So before getting to the Midrash, let's think about this for a second. What would you expect people who have been in the Midbar for 40 years to look like? You'd expect them to look dirty, to have clothing that's worn out and raggedy, clothing that doesn't fit them. They would look sweaty. You'd expect them to look like people who've been in the wilderness for 40 years. And Moshe basically says to them, look at yourselves. You don't look anything like this. Your clothing isn't worn out. Your feet aren't swollen. Your bodies aren't showing signs of wear and tear. So that's a remarkable thing to point out. And then there's a Midrash brought down by Rabbeinu Bachya. I'm going to read that version of it on this pasuk that seems to be really strange because it seems to be focused on some very, very mundane and seemingly trivial things when you think about the Midbar experience. Shal Rabbi Eliezer es Rabbi Shimon. Very practical question. How did Bnei Yisrael have clothing for 40 years? The answer, Mima shehalbishum malachi asharis. The malachi asharis provided clothing for them. Okay, next question. But didn't these clothing wear out? And he responds, what do you mean? The pasuk says, Sim lascha lo b'samei alecha. The pasuk we just read. And he keeps going. And he asks, what about the children who grew up in the Midbar? How did they have clothing that fit them? And now things start to get really interesting, because the answer is, the answer is, look at this reptile creature whose exterior grows with it. So too their clothing grew with them. Okay. And he keeps pressing. Didn't they need to do laundry? How did they do laundry? Just like funny to even read this Midrash with these kind of questions. Who would even think to ask these kind of questions? Just somehow there were miracles that were taking place. But that's not how he answers. And he gives an answer that the Anani Yaakov somehow were able to take care of laundering their clothing for them. And then getting to the last one, which I found the most interesting, is didn't they sweat a lot and smell, and didn't the clothing just deteriorate from that? Amarlo, so he answered him, Habe'er hayama led lahem mine dishayim, shahaya rechan nodaf. Vahayu mina'anin bahen, shneamar benosesha yaritzeni. So apparently, the Be'er Mayim that was there also supported some kind of vegetation, an area of grass around it, where Bnei Yisrael would roll around in it, and that would freshen up the clothing and take care of their body odor and give them a good fragrance. Right? Shinamar binostesha yarbitzenis, quotes a pasuk from Tehillim describing sheep that will just roll around in the pastures. And it also adds that Shlomo HaMelech referenced this in Shir HaShirim when he said, V'reach salmotayich kareach levanon, that the fragrance of your clothing is like the fragrance of Lebanon. Lebanon is known in Tanakh as a place with a very lush landscape. The imagery of Bnei Yisrael actually rolling around in grass surrounding the Be'er in order to freshen up their clothing is interesting to say the least. And so I'm looking at this Midrash and I'm just trying to figure out, what is the lesson of this Midrash? Is the lesson simply that Hashem just did miracles for us? So then what are all these different answers? Just say, okay, it was an ace. Everything was an ace. What are these different answers, and what's this back and forth trying to highlight to us? So I think one of the clues to really uncovering what this Midrash is trying to portray for us actually comes from the first answer that's given and the pasuk that's referenced. The first question was, where did they get clothing from in the Midbar? And the answer was the Malachi Asharis provided it for them. And it quotes a pasuk from Yecheskel saying, I clothed you in embroidered garments. Now, what's interesting about this pasuk is that it's found in Perek Tezayin in Yechezkel. And that Perek is where Hashem portrays Bnei Yisrael as an abandoned child who he comes to take care of and nurture. And what's striking about the description about Hashem's action towards us is that it's not about survival. It's more about care and nurturing. So, for example, I bathed you with water, anointed you with oil, clothed you with garments, covered you with silk. To me, this sounds like language of care, not really language of survival. This is more focused on the types of things beyond just sustenance and nutrition. This imagery portrays more about a relationship between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. And I think that might be the key to understanding what this Midrash is doing. Think about when Moshe is saying this. He's saying this at the end of 40 years in the Midbar, and they are about to enter Eretz Yisrael. And they're going to face a challenge, which is that in the Midbar, it was very easy to recognize Hashem's involvement in their affairs, how he provided for them, and how he cared for them. But in Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be a completely different landscape. And Moshe is saying, let's look back at the Midbar experience. What does it mean to experience Hashem's care? So it's not only in the miraculous, but it's also in the mundane things. Things that if you didn't look back at and it wasn't pointed out to you, you might not even notice. The fact that you had clothing with you this whole time. The fact that even as you grew, you were able to have clothing that fit you. The fact that you were, so to speak, provided with deodorant. The fact that you're standing here right now after 40 years and you don't look like people who have just been wandering the desert for 40 years. But you look like menches. You look like people with real kavod. I think that's what the Midrash seems to be portraying here. And when I was looking at the pasuk, B'noseh Yarbitzeini, originally I just thought it was a cute reference to make as part of the answer about body odor and fragrance. But when I realized that this is actually from the Perek in Tehillim, Chaf Gimel, that starts off Mizmor LeDavid, Hashem Roi Lo Echsar, I realized that it could be the reference that they're making is more than just an illusion. Because this Perek starts off with the recognition that Hashem is my shepherd and I lack nothing. And what does he do for me? I would expect the first description to first and foremost mention that he provides me with sustenance and makes sure that I have what to eat. But that's not what the pasuk says. Instead, the pasuk continues, B'noseh Yarbitzeini Almei Menuchos Yinahaleni. He provides me with a place where I can just be, pasture that I can roll around in, and a water that's very calming. But that imagery is very easy to appreciate when you're the actual sheep that's being led by your shepherd in the Midbar environment. But what does that look like in Eretz Yisrael when you're the farmer and you have your own field? I actually think that the Parsha of V'haya Im Shema describes what that relationship should look like. The structure of those psukim, where it says, V'nasati mithar tzechem, then v'asafta diganecha, and then again, V'nasati esev b'sadcha. It's interesting. It's saying, V'nasati, v'asafta, v'nasati. I give, you act, and I'm still giving. And maybe that's the awareness and consciousness that Moshe is trying to prepare them for. Even the grass that's growing in your field that your animals will be able to feed from needs to be viewed as v'nasati. That even that is an expression of Hashem, the provider. That the method of provision may have changed now that they're in Eretz Yisrael, but the provider is still the same. So it turns out that a Midrash that has a funny discussion about very mundane things like laundry and making sure your kids have clothing that fit, and making sure that your body and that your family's bodies don't smell, really is trying to portray to us what does it mean to experience Hashem's care. And how are we going to be able to recognize that and appreciate that in a very different landscape than the Midbar? The challenge of Eretz Yisrael is going to be that when you're standing in your own field, looking at all of the crops and looking at all the grass that's growing around you, are you still going to be able to declare, Hashem Roi Lo Echsar? Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoy these episodes, feel free to follow this podcast so that future episodes will show up on your feed. In our next episode, we're going to take up a very popular pasuk found in David Hashem Ori, which we are saying every day this time of year. David HaMelech says, Ki avi veibi azavuni v'Hashem ya'asfeni. That his parents abandoned him, and Hashem is the one who gathered him in. What exactly does he mean by that? And how does that have anything to do with his relationship to Hashem? See you on the next road trip.